we are live with Jane Ruby, president of League of Women Voters Chicago on the Female Body Politic. I am so happy to be with everybody. You've already got 8 people on. And Jane and I were talking in the, preview room earlier, and she started telling this great story, and I had to stop her because I wanted you all to hear it. So, Jane, who were you just interviewing, and why does this matter to you?
So tomorrow is Women's Equality Day, and the fun fact about Women's Equality Day, the first U.S. president to acknowledge and sign off on the proclamation for it was one Richard Nixon. He is quite an interesting person in history, and I've always been really fascinated with him. It's probably, my fascination with Richard Nixon that got me started in politics and political history and such. And so for tomorrow, we've rebranded Women's Equality Day, Women's Inequality Day, because
Mm.
of the times that we are in. So the League of Women Voters US this will be the second annual Women's Inequality Day. But for that, I was actually interviewing Jill Winebanks, who is the Watergate girl. She was the only woman on the special prosecution team for Watergate. And whenever I get to talk with Jill, she's one of my heroes and stuff. It's always really interesting because she just finds my fascination with Richard Nixon really kind of funny, and it sort of balances out like all of the bad stuff that she has to say about Richard Nixon, with all of the sort of really interesting fun facts and kind of things that make him, a much more likable character in
Complex
American history.
person. I mean, he was raised as a Quaker. He was, kind of was the one who started pulling us out of Vietnam. Like, he is a very complex person who continues to speak to, our own current moment in a number of ways. But yeah, so anyway, you were interviewing her.
Yeah, and it just like it's sort of a, kind of an interesting full circle moment, I love what I do with the league, and it's just truly an honor to be able to get to talk with people who not only were a part of the history that I find so fascinating, but to also connect that to sort of the work we're doing today, from the hyper grassroots level all the way up to the federal level. So it's been a nice day, morning with Jill Winebanks, afternoon with you.
Yay. Well, yeah, so let's just back up a second because you are the president of League of Women Voters Chicago, which if I'm correct, is the largest League of Women voters in the country. Is that right?
It's definitely, I haven't done like the full data analysis, but we're definitely one of the larger leagues in the country. It's not just to the credit of me. I think that, the Chicago is such a hub for activism and for women in activism around voting rights, around civil rights. Like,
Mm-hmm.
women's suffrage was it's a bit of a rivalry between Wisconsin and Illinois, but Illinois signed the papers for ratification first, but Wisconsin delivered the papers to get like stamped or whatever. So I still like to claim credit for Illinois that we were the first ones to sign the papers. But, just as far back as women's suffrage and stuff, like there's such incredible work being done in Chicago around
Mm-hmm.
civil rights, around human rights, around gender equality, that, it's such an honor to represent an organization that really has built quite an amazing, not just Chicago based League of Women Voters organization, but also the coalitions that we get to work with on a wide variety of issues, from environmental stuff, voting rights. There's so many amazing things. So I'm so proud of, the large membership that we do have.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, I think I love meeting you and getting to interact with you. For those of you who don't know, Jane is part of in addition to being the president of League of Women Voters Chicago, she's also a member of the Female Body Politic Book Club. And before getting to know you, I kind of had this incorrect sense that the League of Women Voters wasn't that active anymore. And yet now I feel like, and especially this moment, and largely because of your leadership and the leadership of many others, but I'm talking to you, is, it's coming more into the forefront, I think, than it has been in the past. Do you get that sense as well that people are starting to rally around League of Women Voters again as a formidable force in the political landscape?
Yeah, I mean, if you just like look at the history and stuff, we've been in the rooms from the beginning of building American women's political power. And,
Hmm.
obviously I think the one of the things that my organization doesn't really do well is the self-promotion because we're too busy doing the work that, to take back and kind of brag about all of the really awesome stuff we've done. I've actually, with very little free time I have, I've been trying to dig through some of the archives and find some of these really pivotal moments that we can then apply to politics today to really sort of, show how important our organization is. When I first joined, there was, everyone was like, oh, why do you want to do League of Women Voters? Like, it's just a bunch of old ladies at a voter registration table at a high school. And, I took offense to that because the reason I joined was, because of the work that, I was seeing the group doing, and I wanted to be a part of that. I could have joined a whole wide variety of other organizations. I was working on campaigns in the partisan sense. And, when I became president, I'm, kind of semi-retired from campaign life. But, everything that I've done sort of, with the league has been very intentional in building up that different perception of who we've always been, but has not always been, the image that has been portrayed.
Well,
Um,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And I am actually speaking at Ms. Magazine's launch of their archive because similarly, right, Ms. Magazine is doing all this work and yet they have not yet compiled until now a complete digital archive, which seems crazy. But when we are doing the work constantly, it's hard to then go back, stop, and, you know, show our work, show what we've done, and show how its relevance is continues into today. And it's so important what you're doing, particularly because as we look for solutions, so much of the what we're confronting today, we have confronted in the past. And I just want to go back to your interest in Richard Nixon and its relation to League of Women Voters because I always read your incredible columns. If you don't subscribe, do. It's at League of Women Voters Chicago. Jane has a great column about the history of League of Women Voters and just women in politics in America in general. But so I was really enjoying your post recently about how America has suffered this same kind of crisis of confidence in the American government, and that was with the Richard Nixon, impeachment. But League of Women Voters really stepped in to help restore that faith and restore the, responsibility that the government had to take. So, like, what were they doing, and why is that relevant to our current moment?
Well, I think the one of the or I would say there's sort of two very powerful things that the league does sort of internally in, our in the sense of how our membership interacts with each other. One is, we have a very grassroots type of organization. So it's happening at the local level, starts at the local level and builds up to sort of our state chapters, our county chapters, and then our national chapter. And that's very different than a lot of other civic organizations work, which are kind of more a top down approach to advocacy and action based stuff, which really kind of gives a lot of power to us as local leagues. So I think that that's one thing that has really kind of stood the test of time in how we're able to activate and do the mission work that we're trying to do. The other thing is, in the same way that we're sort of grassroots up, we're grassroots up with our positions too. And sometimes it can take years for the league to adopt a position on a particular issue. And I think that that whole process, in this day and age, people are so quick for instant feedback, instant comms. We have to be doing things fast. And I think it's also important that there's, long games being played too, and to be very intentional with the things that we adopt as our positions. We can't have a position on every single thing in the entire world, but the things that we do take positions on, the things that we do act is with intention, and it comes with that 100+ years of history of smart, informed women and men who, have really kind of taken the time to build who we are and what we stand for.
Yes, and I think it is so important, and I think we're coming to, at least I see this more and more. We're coming to acknowledge that while the reaction is important, right? So is the long-term strategy and the power in that long-term strategy that the League of Women Voters brings. However, that does lead me to my next question, right? Because you said it takes years to adopt a position. And yet, the League of Women Voters, as you have just outlined, is, one of those organizations that moves slowly but moves intentionally. But within the first couple days of the Trump regime, the second one, League of Women Voters declared a state of constitutional crisis. So, what does that mean that an organization like League of Women Voters took such a drastic step?
Yeah, I mean, it's really spooky. Like, I am seeing my rights as a woman in this country being slowly stripped from me. I had more rights when I was, 10 years ago than I do right now, based on the trajectory that our country has really taken. And, this isn't the first time, as you said, in our history that we've had to be bold in messaging, and a lot of it is, for the sake of the public, and, giving the public sort of guiding stars at which that they can then, be informed and active participants in our democracy. I would say personally, I would say, and I'll cover my league button when I say this, but I would say we were in a constitutional crisis as far back as 2020 when the ERA was not published as part of our Constitution, having met all of the legal requirements in our Constitution for ratification. So, I would say that the crisis started, long before when we started to not adhere to the rules in our Constitution. And that has really we have seen that escalated to such a degree that we need to kind of get back to our foundation. We need to get back to civics education where people read the Constitution and understand what's at stake, and then see how many times that things have gone against the founding document of our country right now.
Yeah, yeah. And, I also think this race to gerrymander all of the states is so problematic, right? Because it's not just about voting. I mean, of course, it is voting is a foundation, but when so many people are disenfranchised through gerrymandering, it becomes very difficult to make the case of why people should vote because we're at a point now where the politicians are picking the voters rather than the voters picking their leaders. And again, voting is the foundation of that. And hopefully, we will be able to overcome this. I'm just curious. I know you said League of Women Voters isn't just voter registration tables, but are you seeing an uptick of voter registration just sort of in your peripheral activities? How are people within your sphere reacting to what's going on now? And are they coming to you for advice and guidance within the realm of League of Women Voters?
Oh, 100%. I think most people pay attention around sort of presidential elections is when they sort of are like, okay, I need to register, I need to vote. And something that we really stress, especially because, I am a local chapter president, is local elections matter. And, in my shirt rotations, I have one that says that very boldly because it really is those local elections that determine the trajectory of where we go as a country all the way up to those big federal elections. Like everything starts local. And, that's really where we sort of stress you have to vote in every single election. And that is where you really build up the power. Like you see in city council, like I've personally seen elections where it's come down to 8 votes
Hmm.
has
Hmm.
determined who has won. And when the stakes are that close, every single vote matters. And so, a lot of our education and communication is around the power of voting, especially at the local level, because that's really where you see these, really intense tiebreakers and, last minute ballot counts. I think in since the last presidential election cycle, a lot more young people are interested in registering. Um, Last year alone, the League of Women Voters registered 10,000 new citizens at naturalization ceremonies. There's been, especially with a lot of the anti-immigration rhetoric coming down, in media these days, really the importance of ensuring that everyone who is a citizen is registered to vote and paying attention and participating has been a big focus for us. There's some pending legislation in Illinois that we're supporting around sort of expanding um, youth getting involved, right when they graduate and being able to vote, that we're actively doing. So, there's a lot of really great stuff at the local level to sort of ensure that voting rights are expanded and protected.
Yeah, and I mean, if we wanna talk about why local elections are important, right? When we see these protests, and particularly I'm gonna talk about Los Angeles because I live in California, and people are out there protesting, ICE constantly, and the LAPD, and anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, this is my general understanding, the LAPD is not protecting the First Amendment rights of the people who are protesting. Then people are taking that up with city council, and city council is not hearing their voices, right? So if you want to change that, vote in your local election. And you can literally, like in a city of Los Angeles, the size of Los Angeles, you think your vote doesn't matter. When I lived in New York, right, I know I could organize my apartment building to sway an election. The same is true in Los Angeles. If you don't live in a major metropolitan area, your neighborhood, your church, your reading group, your like volunteer group at the local animal shelter. This is what it can take to sway a local election. And it's not just protest, it's environmental policies on a local level, housing policies on a local level, voting policies, on and on and on and on. And it doesn't just affect your local elections, right? Your local governments, and Boston is a great example of this. How local decisions can be basically an incubator for national policies. So, yes, Jane, 100% everyone should vote in every single election, especially their local elections. Um, yeah, how is you wrote about recently too the speaking of our rights being eroded, you wrote about the Patriot Act and how its quarter century anniversary is coming up, which is crazy to me because that makes me feel really old because I was protesting the Patriot Act in college. But, it's people think that or I don't think it's not that people think that, but it the Trump regime's attack on our civil liberties seem novel, but in fact, they're not. They started at the beginning of the century with the Patriot Act. And again, the League of Women Voters were instrumental in fighting back against that. How do they do that? And what lessons can we learn today from their continued action?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking back to sort of that time period, there it wasn't just the league. And I think that there's something really powerful about coalition building, especially in the civic space, where it's like the more groups you can get together to, take a stand, like, we're kind of seen as the watchdogs of democracy, like, our organization, ACLU, Common Cause, like, there's incredible organizations that do a lot of the same stuff that we do. And when we can partner together, it kind of feels like it's sort of like a superhero team that, that really kind of is like, oh my gosh, like we need to be paying attention to this because like literally everyone is, standing up against this. Um, and so, there's so many moments like that, the league has really kind of been, messengers of resistance and, good government policies. And, what I was saying earlier about, it takes a long time for us to, sort of arrive at our positions, but we also ensure that our positions are fluid enough that, things can adapt for changing times. So, it's
Mhm.
not like, uh, our position on something like reproductive rights we've had for decades at this point. But it doesn't mean that that's the only sort of narrow definition of something that we support. There's, room to apply it in so many different capacities. And I think that that fluidness of the positions is also, one of the things that kind of gives us longevity, gives us the ability to jump into moments of injustice in particular and sort of be on the right side and fight for what's just. On the other side, that's sort of like a, you know, uh, more darker, somber side of that kind of power of advocacy. On the more lighthearted thing, one of my favorite topics to discuss or, fun facts about the league is how instrumental the league was in the United States signing on to the United Nations. And that was a massive league campaign. Like it was like, hundreds of thousands of flyers and people taking to the streets demanding that the United States, sign on and be a part of the United Nations. And that was, because the the league were in the room when the United Nations Charter was signed, and that sort of groundswell of support is also, it's a similar thing of, using our activism, for advocacy, but it's such like a powerful thing when you think of, it's been 50 plus years of, United Nations work, how the league was there from the beginning, and we still also participate in the United Nations as as part of observers to the Economic and Social Council. And so, there it's sort of both grassroots, national, and even global. We have this sort of wide net of ways we can engage, activate, educate, and push forth progressive, in the sense of progress moving forward, positions and legislative stuff, and just, bring more people into this process and bring more people into our democracy in an engaging way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the really important things about your work as a historian and as an organizer, but is talking about this precedent as of women bringing people into the process. And you talked about, the League of Women Voters being instrumental in getting the U.S. to sign on to the UN. And women's work even predates that, right? Because after World War I, as you know, Jane Addams and the Women's International League of Peace and International League of Peace, I think it's called the WILPs, um, basically formed an international coalition of women to draft alternative articles to the Treaty of Versailles. 9 of their points were adopted by Woodrow Wilson to crafting his 14 points, which were, of course, the basis for the League of Nations and then the United Nations. And our work as women is so erased, so forgotten, and just so uncredited. And it's vital that we re unearth this work, if only because it is proof that there is hope to get us out of the moment that we're in. And we just talked about local elections, which are so important. And then we look at sort of the morass that the world is in, right? With wars exploding everywhere. And we think we have no control, we have no power, we have no way to affect change, sort of on this international level of diplomacy. But that's just not true. Women have been doing that work for over 100 years now and doing so effectively. Um, and like, so how can, and one of the things that you said to me in just a conversation of ours is that, when League of Women Voters, when you just put that name on, right, your email, you start to get response from people. And I think a lot of people feel like, okay, my voice doesn't matter. I might vote, but if I call my congressperson, that's not going to make a difference. But how has operating in the League of Women Voters given your voice sort of even more amplification than you would have on your own?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just in sort of my personal narrative, like, you know, working in partisan politics and sort of having the big, bold ideas and creativity that I do have in my brain, I was told no a lot. Like, no, we can't do this thing, or no, we can't do this. And I was sort of like, wow, this is like, really limiting towards really anything. And doing the work with the league, it's like, as long as, we're within the bounds of our positions, which, we have a big book of all of our positions. You can, find it online and such. There's so much freedom to the work that we can be working on, and it became sort of a totally different game when I was looking at sort of my priorities as an activist, as a, organizer, and looking at the sort of the kind of world that I want, not just for myself and other women, but, future generations. Like, I have a 2-year-old son, and I'm constantly thinking about the world he wants, and to use the league, um as a gateway to really getting the progressive change we want has been an incredibly different shift.
Mhm.
The stuff that we're pushing for, in Chicago and beyond is things like ranked choice voting, campaign finance reform, redistricting reform. There's so many incredible positions that would make a much more inclusive and equitable democracy. And
Mhm.
I don't have to be, told, "Oh, one party doesn't want that, or another party doesn't want that, or no, that's not, on our agenda right now." It's like, no, let's figure out the ways that we can organize and get this stuff done and get people to understand that these are the things we want. These are things that are really important to be paying attention to. And, it's a much more groovier situation when I can call up and be like, "Hey, I'm with the League of Women Voters, and I want to talk about CEDAW," which is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, like UN treaty, which the US has not signed on to. But there's a grassroots movement, led by a lot of local leagues to get ordinances passed for that. But it's like, it's really groovy. I can be like, "Hey, I want CEDAW." And I don't have to like sort of feel like, it's going to be sort of a no space. It's very much, okay, like, the league's paying attention to this, I get, like, let's hear what they have to say.
Yeah, and just like, collective voices working together, and then also to have that, 100 plus year of history behind you as well is so important. And, I'm often I always ask people that I'm interviewing, like, what can people do to get involved or to make change? And so often that is, join a local group. And League of Women Voters is an awesome space to do that, regardless of where you live, because they do have so many resources. I just sent like every single League of Women Voters president, as you know, an email about my book that's coming out. So I'm like, buy my book about Jeanette Rankin.
Yeah.
And just the responses I got were so amazing, interest, the enthusiasm, and the passion for preserving democracy. So even if it seems like it's a small organization, it's not. You have, the backing of, millions of women that are joined together behind you. So I absolutely encourage everyone to join. And the other thing that you said that was so interesting to me, and this is sort of more feminist than it is directly related to politics, but just being told no. And I think a lot of times, whether it's for your political aspirations, whether that's running for office or getting ranked choice voting or wanting to be a, neurosurgeon or what have you, women are so often told no. And we adjust our dreams. And I know a lot of people talk about the dream gap, but I just found it so important that you mention this in regard to democracy, right? Because the size of our dreams impact the size of our reality. And I always think about, like, right, like goldfish are actually koi fish. It just depends on the size of their pond or their bowl.
Yeah.
And the bigger we can dream, the bigger we can, affect our reality. And I just want to go back to what you were saying about the things that League of Women Voters are working on right now, because it is reshaping democracy in a way that I don't think a lot of women or just any gendered Americans have allowed themselves to think of. Is that your cat?
Sorry, yeah, my
No,
cat loves to
I was like,
make an appearance.
love it, little cameo. And I heard it and I was like, is that my kid screaming outside? I'm just gonna ignore it. So cute. Gotta have the cat. But yeah, so can you talk a little bit? I mean, first of all, I want to talk to you about ranked choice voting all day and then anything else that League of Women Voters is doing. But let's talk about ranked choice voting and why, like what it is. Tell us what it is, Jane, and why it's important. Because this is the female body politic. Why is it important for women? Why can ranked choice voting allow us to dream bigger and go bigger?
Yeah, I mean, there are jurisdictions in the United States that currently use ranked choice voting. So there's really great data on sort of how it's working here in the United States. But I guess one of my favorite examples, which the historian and you might also find interesting, is sort of one of the origins of ranked choice voting was actually in Ireland out of sort of the Irish Treaty and Civil War, and it was sort of like, well, what kind of elections are we gonna have in Ireland? And the population there was divided, not just Protestant and Catholic to have to balance, but also the pro-treaty Irish and also people who were still, not very happy with the treaty, the anti-treaty. And so you really had to kind of balance not just political ideologies, but also religious ideologies. And they came up with, a form of ranked choice voting that, it easily could have been a majority party that comes in, they could have decided they wanted a particular kind of election and reign supreme. But they were thinking, how can we actually have a more balanced democracy and balance all of these different, combative ideologies to build a stronger nation?
Hmm.
And that sort of, very much plays into a lot of kind of, what you and I do in history in the United States is, especially in the gender equity space, the founding of our country was not meant for us. It was not meant for us, and it was not meant for a lot of other people. So when we're fighting for things and we're fighting for continued equity, we're begging for, a very restrictive system to allow us to have the freedoms that we should have had from the beginning. And so that's where a lot of modern democracies kind of excel, is because they were able to build gender equality. They were able to build more balanced forms of democracy and participating in democracy that we don't have here. And I think, ranked choice voting is a great example. Our system of voting and government and elections, was made to be quite restrictive. And what we're seeing now is sort of, looking at places where alternative voting methods have been explored and have been quite successful, has been really inspiring. And I think especially with ranked choice voting, to connect it back to sort of the Irish situation, when you have a balanced democracy, gender-wise and ideology-wise, that's really where your democracy can work a lot better. And I think, ranked choice voting is one of the low-hanging fruit in building more equitable democracy and elections and giving voters more option. I think you had asked me to explain ranked choice voting, but
No, that's
basically,
okay.
the idea of having more option, having more choice, and not being limited to just voting for one person and, having resentments, having feelings like, maybe I shouldn't even vote because I don't like any of the options. Like those sorts of decisions that I encounter every day when I talk to voters. And then when I give them the option, like, hey, wouldn't it be really groovy if Chicago had ranked choice voting and you wouldn't have to be, stymied with your options? They're all like, oh, this is really cool. I could get behind that. And so I think, the more conversations that we have about what the options are, what the alternative methods are, to what you were saying about sort of building a stronger democracy and looking towards viable solutions that are not what we currently have, I really think that that's the future.
Yeah, yes. And, you said alternatives. And I think most people in this country still, right? We live in a bubble of like, in politically informed folks. But like most people don't even know what ranked choice voting is. and that it's constitutional. You can implement it now. You can implement it on the, municipal level, and you can even do it on a congressional level. And, to go to my own expertise and my book, Jeanette Rankin, America's first congresswoman, is case in point in that she was elected to Congress in 1916 because of ranked choice voting, right? She could say, vote for your local man and vote for Jeanette Rankin. And you didn't have this sense of animosity between candidates because you're trying to not divide and conquer, you're trying to build coalitions. And that is, of course, the antithesis of what we have right now, where you're constantly asked to decide between the lesser of two evils. And, of course, I think the Democrats are by and large not evil, but a lot of people have their qualms about him, and that's fine. And the other thing about ranked choice voting is that so often women, people of color, Black people, people of the LGBTQ community, and so many other marginalized people are told, oh, you're not a viable candidate. You have to wait your turn. The white guy with the law degree is more electable, so the party's going to get behind him. And, the most recent example of ranked choice voting success, of course, is Mamdani in New York City, where everyone was very concerned that Andrew Cuomo was going to win the Democratic primary. And, because of ranked choice voting, New Yorkers were not forced to choose between the lesser of two evils, but were allowed to vote their conscience and elect Mamdani. And you may or may not agree with Mamdani's policies, but I think what has to be recognized was that the will and the voice of the people was better expressed through this election.
And
And
also
I
it was
will
more
never,
exciting, it was
yeah.
more competitive. People were interested in what the candidates had to say. The candidates were having really interesting, interactions with each other where, it was like rank me first, rank me second. It really kind of not just on the election side of democracy working well, but also on the campaign side, you saw a lot of innovation in how campaigns were being run. But I think, at the end of the day, the amount of people who turned out to vote in that New York primary was just astronomical. I think it might have been one of the highest voter turnouts for a primary in New York's entire history. And I think,
And it was the highest among young people ever.
yeah, and I think, what regardless of who, you would have supported in that election, people turned out to vote because they were excited about the opportunity to, like they were voting based on vision of what they wanted to see for their city. And I think that those sorts of actions are incredibly healthy for democracy. And, it's something that is currently already happening in quite a lot of places in the country. We do have ranked choice voting that's being used. And to sort of mirror that more and more, I think we're just going to keep having more success stories. And hopefully more legislatures pushing for ranked choice voting. I know we have a current Chicago ordinance that was just introduced this summer, and we're going to be doing a really big campaign around ranked choice voting for Chicago elections.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Let's offline about that because I would love to do a video or a reel or something for y'all. I do want to acknowledge Sneaky Revolt, who said, "I wonder why ranked choice voting in Maine has brought some truly terrible results." Of course, she's talking about Susan Collins, who is not awesome and is difficult for me because I want to be supportive of women politicians. I want to be supportive of Susan Collins, who had great promise, but of course she has voted with the Trump regime so time and time again. And yeah, no, ranked choice voting is not a panacea. It does not cure democracy immediately, but I think it is about it's we don't always like the results of democracy, but let it be democracy. And we don't have actual democracy right now. But thank you so much, Sneaky Revolt, and LePage as well. She notes. So yeah, but I would say by and large, when we have ranked choice voting, we do have better results, and they're not necessarily the results we want to see, but they are results that get people to the polls. And I also have great hope that Susan Collin will be voted out this time. So be sure to register, all you Mainers out there. But I do want to go back to this idea that democracy needs to grow, right? And don't get me wrong, I love Biden. I'm not a Biden hater, but I think it's like way too like a Marvel movie, like cliche, that our two options at this important crux and uh, you know, democracy were between two old guys who have health issues, documented health issues. Um, and that it is far too like just paradigmatic of what we're facing. And we can talk about why Kamala Harris uh, lost or didn't. I think the point is, and the important point that we need to take away is that we have to, if our democracy doesn't grow, it's going to die. And that's where we are now. And as we look at these issues, right, whether that's a woman's right to choose or our ability to express our First Amendment rights, so much of them go back to not just voting, but how we vote. And so that's so exciting to know that the League of Women Voters is addressing not just like voter registration, which is vital, but also, the means by which we vote. I mean, when I first started writing this book on Jeanette Rankin, for those, I guess I already said she was the first congressperson, but right, she was advocating for ranked choice voting, multiple member congressional districts, and abolishing the Electoral College in like 1914, which seems crazy. But I'm just really excited for all this work that you're doing and that I'm doing and so many other people are doing to bring women's history back into the contemporary discourse. So hopefully we can push these, reforms into reality. I mean, do you have in your work or day to day in your long term visions, are you seeing this as a possibility, or are you like, no, this is still years or decades in the future? Or do you think we're like on the cusp of of a big reform?
Yeah, I mean, some of my heroes that, I kind of say are like the ancestral spirit in the work that I do. It's people like Ida B. Wells. It's people like, to the Irish, to go back to Ireland, Countess Constance Markovic. It's people that, really sort of not just brought bold vision, but were willing to push to the limits to ensure that people understood really what was at stake for women and marginalized communities and really push for change. Alice Paul, like people who, it was to go back to, sort of a lot of the misconceptions about the league is, we're sitting around having tea parties or, we're like, it's not the full story. I think that there's a balance between sort of, uh, that side of getting people to pay attention and advocacy, but also, really sort of putting yourself out there and saying, no, this is not right. And these are things that we have to fight for and defend. And I think that, having that kind of balance is incredibly important moving forward. I think that I have like this sort of, ancestral fire in me of these, people throughout history that have done this work. And that's what sort of helps me get up every morning and be like, instead of doom scrolling, I'm like, what would Alice Paul do? It's like you kind of have to like, and I'm sure you sort of have a similar feeling with Jeanette Rankin, where it's sort of
Yeah.
like, these people wouldn't be doom scrolling or, seeing what's on like, Twitter or Blue Sky or Instagram. They'd be out doing, they'd be taking to the streets to talk to people, to get people to understand what's at stake, to, in some cases putting their life on the line, and it's like, it's just very different, how society these days, has been a little bit more like backseat complacent in how we actively participate in these situations. We held this incredible Know Your Rights seminar that was geared towards, activists to, what do we do in situations of confrontation at protests and rallies and such. And one of the interesting things was, this older woman, and she coined the term owl, old white lady. And it was like, what could the owls do? And in a lot
Mhm.
of cases, the owls have to be at the, putting themselves out there in front of the police, in front of the rallies, and saying, this is something we're not going to stand for either. And that idea of what we're doing, and not everyone has to be out in the forefront, but we need to stand for something. We need to stand up for what's right. We need to, reconnect to community, talk to people again. And, that's really where we're going to sort of build the change and build the future that we want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that League of Women Voters isn't just having tea, right? But it is partly having tea. But that's incredibly important because it can't just all be crisis mode all the time. It also has to be, let's get a cup of coffee and talk politics, but also talk about our kids, talk about our work, talk about our partners, talk about whatever. Because that is a political act as well. That is a work, that is an act of regeneration and resistance. And we
Oh,
need more of.
100%.
Yeah, and going back to your point about doom scrolling, it's just, this isn't not my lane necessarily, but I just see people walking around. I know we're on a phone right now and everybody's watching us on a phone. Don't tune out or whatever. But, people just walk around with their phone in their hands. And I just my heart breaks because I've done it too. I do it too. And it's like, the world around you is lost in our 2 by 6 inch screen. And again, going back to this idea of, our reality can only be as big as our dreams. If our reality is defined by 2 by 6 inches, then we can't possibly, affect the change that we want to see in the world. So, yeah, again, I'm not going down this rabbit hole, but yeah, community is everything. And I think before this election, I didn't really get it. I've always been a political activist, and that's taken numerous forms. I've done international development, anti-child labor work, also like socially engaged art, and, and everything in between. And for a long time, I was like, this is good work. I'm glad I have a purpose in life. I don't want to push paper, but I don't really know if what I'm doing is actually important. And now I'm like, no, this is everything. Like building community, talking to each other, book clubs, sewing clubs, whatever. Like that is where our heart as a country is built. And we're running out of time, but I just want to talk to you real quick about, you mentioned that this fire of your ancestors is in you. And I think we like first connected about doing this talk right before the 4th of July. And, I am like a true patriot. Like I love this country. I love the promise of the country. I love the idea of the country. I love what this country can become. And you could just talk about, your 4th of July rituals and why you're so into 4th of July, mostly for my own enjoyment, so I can do what you do.
I mean, I am a nerd for America, and that feels so icky to say because I feel like we need to like really we need to like take that back. Like we used to, we're so much about who we are as individuals, and I think like the idea of us being a citizen and us being American has really sort of, become kind of an icky thing to be proud of. But I think we have like a pretty, it's a complicated history, but there's moments of really sort of, reconciling history, fighting for what's right that, are just equally as important to, acknowledge and support. I only recently found out that I am a cousin of George Washington's. And, like, it kind of makes sense because of just what a history nerd I am, but I'm like, oh my. So whenever I see like his picture, I'm like, hey, cousin,
Because
which is pretty cool. And, my husband and I got married on John Adams's birthday. Every Valentine's Day, we watch the John Adams miniseries, which, if you haven't seen, is, I think, the most accurate depiction of what what was really going down there. Hamilton is not as accurate. But, I think having, the sort of like nerdness that you and I both have as like history people and American history people and pride is, why I think, we just get along so well, and why it's incredible to have spaces like this to be able to talk about that, because I do think like the reclaiming history and, working to better our country is so important to what we do. Like, I mean, I was an art major and like, a kooky punk rock artist at one point in my life. But for me, I would always go and vote with my parents. And I would always be like, I just voted because I like flipped the little switches on the ballot box. And I had such pride with that. And it just at a certain point in my life, it was like, what can I use my creativity and my passion for? And what can I use my interest in history and politics, which was just like so much also, just as much a part of my DNA as, being a cousin of George Washington.
Mhm.
And it sort of evolved into what I'm doing today. And I couldn't be more prouder or more patriotic to be getting to do my mission work with the League of Women Voters in this country at this time when stuff feels really heavy right now. There's still so much positivity, so much optimism, so much we can be working towards. And this it couldn't be the biggest honor of my life to be doing that with the League of Women Voters.
Yes, I feel the same way. It's, I that's so funny that you're a punk because I was a punk too. Like totally going to Bikini Kill shows, telling my mom I was like going to my friend's house or whatever, but at the same time being like very invested in the American promise. So no wonder we get along. And yes, I feel like my whole life has been in preparation for this moment. And, what gives me hope is getting to know so many women, especially you, and knowing we are in this together. And, um, it's an we're an unstoppable force when we are in community together. History shows time and again that when women come together, we cannot be stopped. So I'm so grateful to be in community with you, Jane, and thank you so much for being here. Before we go,
Thank
tell
you.
everybody, where we can find you, where we can read your wonderful writing, and how folks can sign up for League of Women Voters to volunteer, to get involved, or anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I'm based in Chicago, so my league is League of Women or LWVchicago.org. You can find all of our information, news articles. If you want to join the league, we have national branch and then chapters everywhere around the country. So there's always, a spot for you. And I highly recommend joining. And there's different ways to get involved. It's reading a newsletter, sharing the information, or, becoming a president of a local chapter. There's such a spectrum of work you can do with the league and feel pride in. So I couldn't recommend it enough. And then I'm also, kind of floating around, on LinkedIn, social media. So I'm available to find and always happy to, continue the conversation. And I'm so excited to read Larissa's book coming out in November. We're gonna
On election day, winning the
On
ticket,
election
November
day,
4th.
we are going to be doing a book club with the League of Women Voters of Chicago and one of our sister coalition partners, Chicago Women Take Action. So very excited for that. And and yeah, here always down to have these conversations. So thank you so much, Larissa, for taking time to hear me sort of rant and rave about all the things I'm passionate about.
They're what I'm passionate about too. I could just talk to you forever, but let's do this again. All right. Thank you everybody for joining, and thank you so much, Jane, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, bye.
Okay. Bye.